Alrighty, folks. So welcome to our segment on motor skill development. So we're going to talk about everything related to movement, motor skills, mobility in infancy and toddlerhood. But I do want to start by saying that an infant's newfound mobility is a lot more than just the movement. It allows them to explore the environment, to make connections, and ultimately to learn important information about the world around them. And they do this through the feedback that they're receiving about their actions. For example, let's say an infant or toddler is pulling the dog's tail, the family dog. A lot can go on here. They might hear feedback from caregivers like, be careful, don't do that, you'll hurt the dog. They might learn information about the dog and how their fur feels and the fact that they have a tail. They almost also might learn consequences about the dog's reaction. Maybe the dog will snap at them to warn them not to do that. So there's a lot going on here, learning about consequences, learning language through caregivers' responses, learning about info about dogs and animals. There could be a lot that occurs in this single interaction. And it's all because they were able to move and act upon their environment. It would not have been possible if they were not able to move and act upon their environment. So what I'm trying to say is that it's more than just the movement and motor skills itself. There's actually consequences for other areas of development, for cognitive, social, and emotional development. It all stems from these motor skills. So it's more than just what's on the surface, the movement itself. It actually has implications for other areas of development through the exploration that can occur through movement. So I just wanted to set the stage by saying that, but let's talk about the areas of motor development. We'll start with fine motor skills. What are fine motor skills? It's the coordination of small muscles. So hands, fingers, wrists. This allows us to grasp and manipulate objects. And for babies and toddlers, it's allowing them to start becoming active participants in daily activities like feeding and dressing, and even other things that get them into trouble, like opening drawers and cupboards and getting into things they shouldn't, and pulling the dog's tail, things like that. So we're going to talk about the early skills here, like reaching and grasping, and then the later skills in terms of manual dexterity and how that develops. So reaching and grasping, we touched on this a bit, I think last week, but let's talk about it a little more and how it actually develops. So as infants gain voluntary behaviors, as opposed to reflexes, they start reaching and grasping a lot more often. They have intentions. They're reaching for things that interest them and grasping them, and they're getting more successful over time. So at first, it's going to be a hit or miss, but they're gradually going to improve with practice. So from 7 to 12 months, their hand and finger movements become a lot better coordinated in this time frame. And we can see the development in this image here, 7 months, 9 months, and a year. So at 7 months, you can see how they grasp things is they kind of just put their whole clubby hand over an object and use their whole hand and palm to grab things. But at 12 months or a year, they're actually using their thumb and their forefinger to grasp things. They're kind of discovering their fingers and the role that they play in grasping. So in these short few months, they're already developing a lot in how they grasp things more precisely. And by 2 years old, their grasping abilities are approaching adult levels. So there's a lot of development occurring in these first couple of years in how they reach and grasp. This is probably when caregivers have to start baby proofing their homes because they can get into trouble now by doing these things. So the control over their hands in these ways invites a lot of different kinds of exploration, right? Banging, shaking, squeezing, throwing, a lot of exploration, and it provides baby with knowledge about properties of the physical world around them. What about later on? Manual dexterity. So let's say now they have reaching and grasping down. Now they're learning to coordinate it in more complex ways. And one example is using a spoon to eat. Very simple to us as adults, most likely, but it does require a process to get to successful coordinated spoon feeding yourself. So let's watch two videos. First, we'll watch a 9-month-old and see how they approach spoon feeding themselves.
Press that button. There you go. Press that button. Press that button. Press that button. Okay, press that button.
All right. So this is a 9-month-old pretty early on in their reaching and grasping abilities. And at this point, they are trying to coordinate those reaching and grasping abilities, how they grasp that spoon. They were very awkward in how they did it, very stiff, right? Getting it to their mouth. This baby did successfully make it to their mouth. A lot of them won't at first. It can be a big mess, and a lot of times they can only kind of bang the spoon on the table or kind of dip it into the bowl repeatedly, which we saw with this baby. A lot of exploration going on, right? They were dipping it a lot at first, and they actually got it to their mouth. But it still was very uncoordinated and kind of awkward. Now let's look at a 2-year-old eating with a spoon. Wow, that kid was really enjoying himself, right? But did you see how advanced he was using that spoon? It was like nothing to him. And that's how much growth occurs, especially in the second year. There's a lot of refining going on in that second year, especially. The first year is more about that exploration and still kind of developing the coordination. But by 2 years, they're approaching adult level in a lot of different things, particularly using a spoon. But in other areas, they are still more novel and developing. So the skills, fine motor skills develop significantly during that second year. Um, Another example is like using a ball in the environment. At 1, they can usually only roll the ball or kind of fling it awkwardly. But at 2, they can usually throw a ball with a fair amount of coordination. So we see a lot of development in that second year. And also at 2, they can also turn pages of books pretty well. They can cut paper with safety scissors. They can start to do that. They can start to string beads onto a pipe cleaner, which is pretty precise. So there's a lot of development occurring. And these things might seem minor to us, but they're actually a pretty big deal to these small humans that are just getting used to this big world, right? And learning how to manipulate things with their hands. And this is a big part of our species. It allows for using and making tools, developing these fine motor skills. So I think, yeah, I had this one last slide here for fine motor skills. These are the milestones. So I won't read through everything here. This is actually from your book directly, but it's kind of illustrating the development. 6 months, we have them putting toys and other objects in the mouth, which you'll see a lot of, and kind of shaking rattles, exploring. 12 months, they can bang objects together and put small objects in cups or containers. And then 18 months, we see even more development, like stacking things, pulling off their hats and socks, scribbling with crayons. And by 2 years, they can drink from straws, feed themselves with a spoon, build pretty complex towers, and open cabinets and drawers and boxes. So good amount of development going on in this case, in the span of a year and a half. So just to illustrate the milestones, what about gross motor skills? This is the other part of the equation of motor development. So gross motor skills are the coordination of larger muscles like torso, legs, and arms. And locomotion is another thing involved here. This is the ability to move around on your own. And that's kind of the big area of development with gross motor skills. Babies can actually move themselves to other areas and explore the environment in that way. And it expands infants' opportunities to learn about the world even further. So we have in the early phases creeping and crawling, and in the later phases we have walking. So let's talk about creeping and crawling first. In the first month or so, babies do something called creeping. And this is when they move or creep very short distances, kind of like crawling, but it's actually due to reflexive pushing movements of their toes and their knees. So it's more of a result of their reflexes, but it does get them to move, so to speak. But again, it is reflexive and it disappears around 2 months. And then A fair amount of months later, around 7, 8, 9 months, we'll see infants start to crawl usually. And they start becoming more skilled at this with practice. They'll start becoming wary of heights. We have something called the visual cliff experiment, which I will link in a video for you after this to watch. But what's happening in this kind of experiment is that there's an illusion of a dangerous drop off, and it's blocked by a piece of glass. There's not actually danger, but it looks like there is a drop, like by a few feet. And infants are not afraid to cross over the edge of this cliff until they have more experience crawling. And then they start to show wariness when they approach the edge of this cliff. So infants with experience will be wary of this depth that they see, and they'll often look at their mother for cues about what to do. And this is something called social referencing. And this will come up a few times this semester, but this is our introduction to social referencing, and you'll see more of that in the video I'll share. But just know that social referencing is when babies look to their caregiver for cues about what to do when they're not really sure, because again, they're still learning about their environment. So that's social referencing, and that's creeping and crawling. Now, the final results, walking. So infants usually begin walking around 1 year old. This is just an average. Some will begin pretty early, like 7 or 8 months sometimes, and others will start walking later, maybe closer to like 18 months. There's, a lot of variability, but the average is 1 years old. And it begins as assisted walking, like their hands are held by caregivers and grasping furniture. And eventually they do it independently. But just because they walk doesn't mean it's coordinated. They're going to be pretty wobbly at first, and they're going to have some challenges walking around obstacles, walking upstairs, walking on slippery surfaces. Um, One study found that infants or new walkers have 17 falls per hour on average. So they're falling a lot. They're really learning to coordinate their walking at the beginning. Now, social referencing is coming back. So let's talk about social referencing with slopes, like the image here. We have a very steep slope. So in a study, they had an adjustable slope like the one here, where you can adjust the angle of the slope. So when the slope was much shallower than it looks here, it was more shallow, the babies proceeded with caution, or they didn't go at all when their mother discouraged them. Going back to social referencing, they look to their mother for cues about what to do when they're not sure. So if the mother is discouraging them from moving forward, they will either not go at all, listen to her, or they'll proceed with caution. However, when the drops are very steep and dangerous, like the one here, babies refuse to walk down even if their mother is encouraging it. Now, of course, set up by a study, the mom is encouraging it. Of course, it is dangerous, but research, they have, safety precautions in place if they actually did try to, but they actually don't, even if their mom is encouraging it. So what happens when social signals from their caregiver conflict with their own assessment? They usually trust their gut, even very early on. They trust their own intuition about what to do if it conflicts with their assessment of what's dangerous and what's not. And this is good news because parents can't protect infants from everything for the rest of their life. They have to learn to navigate the world on their own. So it's a really interesting finding that toddlers that are walking will actually trust their instincts a lot of times if they perceive danger, even if their caregiver is telling them to move forward with it and says it's safe. So that concludes our talk on motor skill development. And the last stop of the day is the role of practice in motor development. But that's going to need a whole other video for that. So that's where we're headed. Thanks for joining, and I will see you in the next video.